Jai Srimad Narayana. Jai Srimad Narayana. Jai Srimad Narayana. Too early for the belly.
Jai Radha Madhava Jai Kunja Bihari 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 Jai Gopi Janavallabha Jai Girivaradhari Jai Gopi Janavallabha Jai Girivaradhari Jai Radha Madhava Jai Kunja Bihari Jai Radha Madhava Jai Kunja Bihari Yashodarandhana Vraja Janaranjana Yashodarandhana Vraja Janaranjana Yamuna Tiravanachari Jai Kunja Bihari Yamuna Tiravanachari Jai Kunja Bihari Jai Radha Madhava Jai Kunja Bihari Jai Radha Madhava Jai Kunja Bihari
Jai Sriman Narayana.
Jaya Sriman Narayana.
Good. Wonderful. Thank you, Arjuna, for doing that wonderful puja. Thank you, Savitri, for leading wonderful kirtan. And everyone. Jaya Sriman Narayana.
Jaya Sriman Narayana.
Jaya Bhagavan Sri Krishna.
Jaya Bhagavan Sri Krishna.
Jaya Shri Guru.
Jaya Shri Guru.
Sanatana Dharma Jayate.
Sanatana Dharma Jayate.
Dharma Rashtra Jayate.
Dharma Rashtra Jayate.
Surya Vangsha Jayate.
Surya Vangsha Jayate.
Om Hari Om. Namaste, everyone. It is absolutely my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon, what is afternoon for us here in Omaha, Nebraska, in the Vedic heartland. And wherever you are, again, welcome. It is absolutely our pleasure to be here with you for this live Satsanga live stream event. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be continuing with the Gopala-Tapani Upanishad. And I'm going to dive right into the verses because I would like to make sure that I leave some time for questions and answers later. So we're going to be continuing the verses. If you want to see them, they're in the actual description of the live stream, so you can follow along there. And we're going to begin with chapter 1, verse 35 of Gopala-Tapani Upanishad. And this verse proceeds in this way. I offer my salutations to Krishna, the husband of the gopis, the master of the cows and cowherds. He is the embodiment of realized knowledge and possesses a form of supreme bliss. Beautiful verse. These verses from the Gopala-Tapani Upanishad, as we've seen, are really quite nice. They're deeply philosophical, but they're philosophical in a way that expresses philosophy beautifully. And this is something that is wonderful. The reason why it's wonderful is because this is how truth should be expressed. You know, it's interesting that people tend to veer toward one or the other. They will tend to veer either toward that which is beautiful or that which is philosophical. And the truth of the matter is, we are meant to actually do both. We're meant to understand things as far as truth, wisdom, knowledge, etc. But on the other hand, it's not the case that knowledge should be something that's dry. It should be something that is expressed in beauty. So it's wonderful that throughout this Upanishad, we see that this is the case, both beauty and philosophy wedded together. But that said, Now let us go through this verse a little bit. The verse begins with, I offer salutations to Krishna. I offer my obeisances, my respects, etc. to Krishna. And as I've said in the past, what a perfect way to begin a verse, where we are beginning, first of all, by offering our respects, our obeisances, our love, our devotion to God, to the divine. You know, it's interesting. We see this again and again and again throughout the Vedic literature. Indeed, we see this as far as how acharyas and gurus in the past have spoken. Indeed, we see this even at the very beginning of our satsanga live streams. That is, that before we actually go very deeply into philosophy, into the actual teachings, the first thing that we do is we say various things praising God. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important for every reason. Actually, it's important for a variety of reasons, including it reminds us of what we're doing. It reminds us that we're not in a university class, we're not in a debate club, we're not somewhere in which, again, we are simply engaging in dry intellectual thought. But rather, this establishes at the very beginning why we are even uttering words at all. And that is to praise God, to know God. And as I'm known to say these days, without games. Why are we gathering together? Why are we studying Vedic scriptures? Why are we engaging in any sort of philosophical pursuit? It is with the idea not just of coming to some sort of intellectual satisfaction. Oh, intellectual satisfaction is nice, but intellectual satisfaction alone will give us nothing. Rather, what is the point of that philosophical satisfaction? It's to know. And to know not just intellectually, to know deep within that indeed God is real, and not just that God is real, but that we are experiencing God in the here and now. This being the case, we first offer our obeisances to Bhagavan Sri Krishna. Then we engage in philosophical pursuit. So let's go on. With the next clauses, now having offered salutations to Krishna, now we understand a few of the attributes of Krishna. We understand a few of the things surrounding Krishna. So, the husband of the gopis. This is one thing that indeed Krishna is. Gopi Jana Vallabha. That Krishna is the husband of the gopis. What is meant by this? What is meant by this is that first we offer our obeisances to Krishna, but second we are being given the very clear knowledge that Krishna is not alone. Krishna is surrounded by his devotees. When we think of Krishna, indeed, we don't think of Krishna as we envision Krishna, dressed in yellow, etc., floating in space. We don't picture Krishna with nothing around him, nothing behind him. Whenever we envision Krishna, whenever we see an image, a poster, anything of Krishna, what do we see? We see Krishna and we see Krishna's devotees. Even if it's just a cow, even if it's just a peacock, even if it's just nature around him. But very often, indeed, with other people, with gopis, gopas, with his friends, with, indeed, the gopis, who are the consorts, the conjugal consorts of Krishna. But we don't see Krishna alone, again, just kind of floating. The reason why this is the case is because the way to understand Krishna to begin with is via reciprocal loving relationship. Indeed, this is what God is. For so many people, sadly, when we think of quote-unquote God in the general, indeed we think of something floating in space. It sounds funny, but actually that is the case. We tend to think of God in isolation, not understanding that, no, if God is God, what does God mean? It means that when you are envisioning God, envision God and everything of value surrounding God. Everyone of value surrounding God. God is not alone. We're not alone. In fact, let me say this in the reverse so we can understand this. We understand we're not alone. We understand that regardless of anything, God is with us. In the same way, when we envision God, God is not alone either. When we envision God, we have to envision, if we can, all of reality, the material and the spiritual world surrounding God. And then, of course, what then to speak of God's devotees? So, this is what is meant by this. He is the husband of the gopis. So, Krishna is not alone. He has his devotees with him at all times. Now let's go on. Who else is he? He is the master. He is Govinda. He is the master of the cows and the cowherds. Now, this is very important too, because what is being evoked here is Krishna in Vrindavana. Krishna, especially before he leaves Vrindavana, before he goes to Mathura, before he goes to Dwaraka, etc., all these places that he ends up going to. This is Krishna in Vrindavana. This being the case, indeed, what was Vrindavana? It was a Vaishya town. It was a town specifically of farmers, and more specifically of cowherds, of dairy farmers, of individuals who had flocks and flocks and flocks, herds and herds of cows. And why did they have those cows? Oh, they were vegetarian. They didn't eat the cows, and yet they had thousands and thousands and thousands of cows. It's because they weren't vegan. It's because they were not vegan. It's because, of course, they lived in a dairy culture. That means that they milked the cows from the milk, and of course there are hundreds of stories in the scriptures about Krishna and all the various personalities surrounding him, where they would take the milk and they would make butter out of it and ghee out of it, etc., etc. This was the sort of beautiful culture in which Krishna lived when he was on the earth a little bit over 5,000 years ago. He lived in a dairy culture, a cow culture. So indeed, now let's go on. Now, having offered our obeisances to Krishna, established a few of the facts about Krishna. Well, who is this Krishna? Now we go a little bit more deeply into philosophy. Still talking about the nature of Krishna, but now getting especially philosophical. He, that is Krishna, is the embodiment of realized knowledge. Let's stop there. So it's interesting how this is, to speak about this in literary terms, this is a smooth transition. It's a very slow transition. You see, we begin by first offering our obeisances to Krishna. Who are we to even say anything to Krishna but to simply offer our obeisances? Now, then we begin to say, well, all right, let's talk a little bit about who Krishna is. Now we're still talking about Krishna, but now we're diving deep into philosophy, into actual philosophy. Let me read this little clause again. Who is this Krishna? We're still explaining, but again, we're explaining deeply. He is the embodiment of realized knowledge. First, let's talk about realized knowledge. What is meant by this? You've heard me say before that knowledge is not all the same. There are different kinds of knowledge. Some knowledge is infinitely more valuable than other forms of knowledge. So, I have a cup in my hand. Is that knowledge? Yes, because it is the opposite of an untruth. If I said I did not have a cup in my hand, yet I was holding one, that would be an untruth. But I'm saying what is the truth. I have a cup in my hand. All right. Was that especially interesting? No. No, unless maybe you're a cup manufacturer and you just really are into cups. Not that interesting. Yet it's knowledge nonetheless, but it's merely factual knowledge. It's knowledge that simply pertains to that which is temporary. You see? Do I have a cup in my hand now? No, of course not. So that knowledge came and went. It was merely factual. This is not the sort of knowledge that's being spoken of here by realized knowledge. Realized in what sense? Well, spiritually. Actual realized knowledge, having realization of that which is indeed of the nature of the eternal. So thus wisdom, eternal knowledge, etc. So by realized knowledge, what is being said is the deepest knowledge imaginable. Knowledge akin to self-realization. Knowledge akin to the highest conclusions, definitive conclusions of philosophy. So we're talking about the highest forms of knowledge. So with this understanding, envision all of the highest forms of knowledge that a person can possibly understand. Now envision all such knowledge that all beings can understand. Now envision that knowledge itself informed in its very source. That source is Krishna. So thus, he is the embodiment of realized knowledge. What an amazing thing to say. Of course, if we understand the nature of God, there's nothing surprising in this. Of course, what is God? Oh, God is the source of all good things. God is the source of all positive attributes, of all auspicious things. That includes knowledge, that includes beauty, that includes truth, that includes and on and on and on. Discipline, that includes forbearance, that includes detachment, that includes compassion, that includes love. Any positive thing that we can think of, we know God is the source of that. But now we're talking about realized knowledge. In other words, that knowledge which is the highest. He, Krishna, is the embodiment of realized knowledge. In other words, he is both the source of such knowledge, but more. That's amazing to begin with, philosophically speaking. But it goes deeper than this, actually. As spiritual people, what are we all seeking? Well, we're seeking that realized knowledge, correct? As individuals who are on the spiritual path, we're seeking, again, that knowledge, that wisdom, that truth which is the highest. Again, not I have a cup in my hand. No, you don't need a spiritual path to know that. But rather, again, what is the meaning of life? And on, all of these deeply philosophical questions. Well, we wish to know these things. How do we know these things? You see, that is the epistemological question. That is the question of all questions. This is why we have tens of thousands of religions all disagreeing with each other, all fighting with each other. This is why we have every ideology on the face of the earth. How do we know that which is truth? How do we know? How do we know? Well, the way that we know is that we go to that source of truth. Very simply. This is what the Vedic scriptures explain to us. How do we know what is that highest truth? Go to that being who is the very embodiment of that truth and who is the source of that truth. So thus, in understanding that Krishna is that embodiment of realized knowledge, that being the case, now being on the spiritual path, now understanding, yes, I, as a living being, wish to know that which is the ultimate, that which is the highest. I want to know what is the meaning of life, and more, I want to serve that meaning of life. Where do I go? I go to that being who, unlike any other being in existence, is indeed both the embodiment and the very source of all realized knowledge. And that is what we do. So in understanding this clause, this one very simple clause, we're understanding exactly what we are to do to know God. We go to God. Now that's the beginning of this sentence. There's more. And he possesses a form of supreme bliss. And he possesses a form of supreme bliss. From a position of divine ontology, of these two clauses, which of them do you think is actually the most important of the two? The second? It's the second. Interestingly. They're both important. Who would not want realized knowledge? And the fact that God is the embodiment of realized knowledge, oh, that is something that is beyond the comprehension of the vast majority of beings, including sometimes even the gods. But more important is the second clause, and that is that he possesses a form of supreme bliss. So now we're going into truly what is the very essential nature of God himself. You know, it's interesting how my guru, one of my gurus, Bhakti Rakshaka Sridhar Swami, he made a very interesting statement. I remember when I first read this in one of his books, and he was quoting Hegel, I believe, and he said something to the effect that, you know, Hegel said something very interesting. He said that when you actually finally do encounter God in the highest, what you encounter is someone who is simply dancing in bliss. And it's a truly amazing thing, actually, when you think about this, that, oh, knowledge, all of these attributes, in other words, that exist in order to produce an effect. Those are all wonderful, but knowledge produces an effect. Interestingly, even compassion is to produce an effect, something that is outside of itself. And I can go on and on like this. Bliss, on the other hand, it's something that exists for its own sake. And when we think of what is the highest intrinsic nature of God, what would God be? God would be a being who is reveling in bliss. So thus, he possesses a form of supreme bliss. Now this form part also is very important. This is where we come to the inconceivability of the nature of God. And yet, for individuals who are devotees, we actually can conceive what this actually means. That it's not merely that, again, Krishna is the source of bliss. It's not merely that he is the embodiment of bliss. It's not merely, in fact, even that bliss is his intrinsic nature, but his very form, that is, his very locus of being itself, is bliss. When we understand this about the nature of God, we understand everything. We understand why it is that God, being God, nothing that is opposite of good can proceed from God. The idea that so many people with a lesser conception of the divine have, that, oh yes, God gets angry, and oh, why does God do this? Why? You find a lot of atheists, specifically Hume, who I find a hilarious, very stupid philosopher from the 18th century. I've read almost everything that Hume wrote. He was one of the silliest philosophers in history. He would complain about God all the time. Like he was complaining about his neighbor down the street who has a dog that won't stop barking. This is how petty-minded someone like David Hume was. He would complain, well, there's so much suffering and inconvenience in the world. You know, why does God do this? Why does God make things so inconvenient? It's amazing how this is how very often how people think of God, is in these petty ways. Well, interestingly, when we understand that in God's nature there's actually nothing, not only is there nothing that is petty, not only is there nothing that is quote-unquote inconvenient, but there is nothing that is the opposite of pure goodness within God. And when we understand this, and only when we understand this, that indeed God is bliss, only then can we begin to approach a proper understanding of the nature of God. Now, all that being said, let's go on to the next verse. The next verse that we're going to look at of the Gopala-Tapani Upanishad, it is still in chapter 1, but now we're going to look at verse 42. And the verse proceeds in this way. I offer my repeated salutations to the incomparably great Sri Krishna, who cannot be divided, in whom there is no illusion, who cannot be equaled, who is pure and the enemy of all impurity. Powerful verse. And we see that this verse is proceeding along the same lines as the verse that came before it, even though they're not sequential. You know, we have one verse and then this next verse comes quite a few verses after. Still, we see that the same theme is here, except even more amazingly, even more beautifully actually, this verse begins again with offering obeisances to Krishna, but with much more detail, with even more enthusiasm. Not just I offer my salutations, I offer my repeated salutations. And to whom? Not just Krishna, but to the incomparably great Sri Krishna. So let's talk about this, about why this now opening, this invocation, is different and much more expanded than the previous invocation. So first of all, not just I offer my salutations, but repeated salutations. What is this indicating? Well, of course, when we think of, oh, I offer my salutations, we think, oh yes, once. I offer my obeisances, and then you get up and, then you speak with God. You speak with God. But no, what this is indicating is that we are to offer our repeated salutations. In other words, we offer our salutations. We offer our obeisances. We offer our devotion to God again and again and again. For how long? For how long? Pick a nice number. 108 times? 1,008 times? 1,000,008 times? In actuality, the ideal, of course, whether it can be done or not within our present form embodied in a body with a limited duration of lifespan, but ideally, we offer our obeisances to God eternally. Even if in our mind, even if internally. In other words, the idea is that we should be always offering our devotion to God at all times. Not just for a limited duration of time, but rather, God being the eternal, being a being who transcends time, we also are to offer our obeisances with devotion in such a manner that those obeisances themselves transcend time. More, as you've heard me say before when we hear about repetition, this is of the nature of sadhana. In other words, let's talk about this even deeper. We can see this idea of repeated salutations, repeated obeisances in two ways. First, and in this sequence, first as sadhana. That is, when we are practicing to develop devotion to God, we practice devotion to God. But this is in sadhana terms. In other words, we are to always think to ourselves, yes, indeed, I offer my obeisances to you, Bhagavan Sri Krishna. What are we doing at any given moment? We're at work, we're in a cubicle somewhere, we're in an office somewhere, we're at a factory, wherever we are, we work at a restaurant, we're in the kitchen, whatever. In our mind, we can always say this, I offer my repeated salutations unto you, Bhagavan Sri Krishna. So as a sadhana, as a practice, we are to do this in such a way that it goes from being at first a sadhana to then the second stage, where the idea is that we cannot but offer our obeisances to God. It is our nature to do so. We do so naturally and at all times. So what does this mean? God consciousness, Krishna consciousness, to the point where indeed Krishna is always there in the forefront of our awareness. So we go from doing this as a repeated, and this is the common word in both stages, as a repeated practice, we go from that to then it being repetition in that we are always offering our obeisances to God for eternity. So now let's go on. Now again, more qualifiers about, well, who is this Krishna? Krishna, Krishna. We hear this word. Who is this Krishna? Who cannot be divided. Krishna is Ekam. God is Ekam. God is one. How interesting is it that in the Aeneads, Plotinus describes God as the one. This is quite literally the word that Plotinus, the Roman philosopher, used for God. And Plotinus, who was Plotinus? Oh, he was someone who, they call him the founder of quote-unquote Neoplatonism. I don't consider Neoplatonism to be a real thing. He was just a Platonist. He was a latter-day, for antiquity, latter-day Platonist. He was an individual who understood the nature of God very deeply. Thus, he wrote these works called the Aeneads, which you can find in translation many, many places. It's worth reading. I've read it several times, actually, and studied it very deeply, including commentaries on it. He was an individual who, his teacher, Ammonius Saccus, was an individual who himself studied Vedanta. He was Egyptian, that is the guru, the teacher of Plotinus. Ammonius Saccus was his name. He lived, I believe, in Alexandria, Egypt, but he himself was known to have traveled to India and spent years there studying very specifically Vedanta. So all that is background. It's interesting that Plotinus also called God literally the one. Now, what is meant by this? And why is it saying here, likewise, that he cannot be divided? Well, this is what is meant by being the one. That Krishna is not a being who, unlike everything in the material world, is a composite entity made of many, many different little bits and pieces. You see, you look at anything in the material world, it's made of bits and pieces. You look at ourselves. You know, what is a human form? Well, it's a thing, a composite unit made of bits and pieces. We have arms, we have fingers, we have head, etc., etc., etc. This being the case, anything that is material being necessarily a composite being, if you have bits and pieces, what can and inevitably will happen? Those bits and pieces fall off. This is the nature of materiality. This is why things age. This is why things fall apart, etc. This is materiality. So thus, what is being said about Krishna? It's actually a very highly philosophical statement. It's saying he transcends all materiality. He is undivided unto himself. He is not material. Everything here is material, even our own bodies. Even ourselves as spiritual beings having a material experience. We are composite beings. We have our Atman, true. But we also have a mind, we have an intellect, we have a body, the body has bits and pieces, etc., etc. Anything that is material, that is the case. What this is saying by who cannot be divided is that Krishna is that being who is fully transcendent. He is the ultimate monadic being. He is transcendent. But now, this next clause is especially important. In whom there is no illusion. Why is this important? Because if God were to step down from this standard 1/1,000,000th of a degree, God would not be God. Illusion is not possible in God. If illusion were possible in God, then that being who you were calling God never was God. It is not God, it never was God. And how many times, for those of you, especially everyone here I know, but for those of you especially who are in the live stream audience, how many verses now, if you've been with me for a long time, especially a few years, how many verses now have we gone through just in the live stream alone, where this verse from the Upanishads, this verse from a Purana, this verse from this scripture repeats this again and again. God does not fall under illusion. This is one of the definitions. If God were to fall under illusion, then indeed by very definition itself, that would not have been God. That would have been a being who proceeded from God, but not God himself. Because again, this is the, please, for those of you who are out there who you've heard the word Vedanta in any context, whether you are an Advaitin, Vishishta Advaitin, Dvaitin, if you are a follower of Bheda, Abheda, Achintya Bheda, Abheda, whatever it is that you claim to follow, let me make the statement so that as a Vedantist, as you may style yourself, you understand this. Vedanta makes this very clear. God does not fall under illusion. This is the very definition of God, one of them, but one of the most important. And again, the totality of the Vedic scriptures say this. Now, why am I going on and on about this? Why is this of such importance? Because very sadly, there is an entire swath of individuals in more recent days, meaning, the last roughly 1,200, 1,300 years. For me, that's yesterday. That's recent for me. So in very recent days, there is an entire swath of individuals who follow Sanatana Dharma who get this one absolutely fundamental philosophical issue wrong. And they believe that indeed God can fall under illusion. Indeed, that's what I am. That's what you are. That's what every being is. We're all God. We've just temporarily forgotten. This is known as Advaita. Well, the totality of the Vedic scriptures in one united and powerful voice explain God does not at any point fall under illusion. He doesn't desire to fall under illusion. He doesn't fall under illusion for fun. He doesn't fall under illusion out of helplessness. At no point can illusion overtake that which is higher than illusion, any more than a shadow can overtake the sun. No, not a light. The sun. Here, we're going to take this shadow, send it on a suicide mission. Here, hurl yourself toward the sun. See if you can affect it. No. No. In the same way, God does not fall under illusion. Illusion itself is a humble servant and trembles in the sight of God. So, again, in whom there is no illusion. So thus, again, the idea that, oh yes, we're all God, I'm God, you're God, everyone's God, the cat is God, it's all God. And we've just forgotten that we're God. We're God in illusion. No, by definition, you're not God if you're in illusion. Now let's go on. Who cannot be equaled. Ah, nice. There you go. All right, enough said. No, I'll comment on this. It's amazing how, again, this clause is confirming what we were just talking about with how God does not fall under illusion. God is not equaled. We're not equal to God. Oh, my Lord. It is amazing how this universe alone has been in existence for multiple billions of years, and this universe is just one of multiple universes that existed previous to this universe, and this goes on for all of eternity, and there has been thought, philosophical thought, since before the beginning of time, actually. And yet it is just so amazing how people will get caught up in a fad idea that is a few decades old, and they will sell their soul to it. Well, this is one of them, the idea of radical egalitarianism. We're all equal, everyone's the same. Indeed, what if God were one of us? Remember that stupid song, Joan Osborne? I remember the person. What if God were one of us? We are so desperate to drag the perfect down to our imperfect level to make ourselves feel better, that indeed we often think that God is indeed just like one of us with all of our flaws, our fears, our stupidities, etc., etc. No. There is no one who is equal to God. God is that which is not just above us. Again, we always tend to think when it comes to equality in quantitative terms. That's for amateurs. We have to think in qualitative terms. It's not merely that we're here and God is 100 billion times quote unquote better than us. No. It is that if we were to find somehow, objectively speaking, the greatest thing, whether it's a person, whether it's an object, whether it's a planet, anything in all of creation, and try to compare that to God, it's not that greatest of all things would be here and God would be kind of here. It's that God would be so above that thing as to stretch into infinity within infinity, an infinite number of times and more. It's not a matter merely of quantity, but the depth would be unsurmountable. So yes, there is nothing equal to God, and that most certainly includes us. Now let's go on. More. Who is this Sri Krishna? Who is pure? Who is pure? We've spoken about this several times, looking at different Vedic verses, but we'll go over this a little bit more. What is meant by pure? No, not in the sense of Puritanism, not in the sense of boring. Oh yes, God is pure. Oh yes, you're not going to find God in a bar somewhere. Yes, that's quite true. You're not. But is that all that it means? Again, in this puritanical sort of sense? No. What is meant by pure is that, again, God being the source of all things, there is nothing that is more. Now, pick a positive attribute. You'll meet a person. I meet such people all the time. Indeed, the vast, if not all, the vast majority of my students I can say this about. You meet people who you meet the person and you just say, that person is good. That is a good person. You may not say it out loud, but you're thinking it. Oh my Lord, I've just met someone who is truly good within. Think of any attribute like this. Good. But now understand that goodness taken again to the state of infinity. That is what's meant by pure. Think of truth that is taken to the place of infinity, and on and on. This is what is meant by who is pure, that God is pure. So again, not just in a moral sense. In a moral sense too, you better believe it. You better believe there's no being more moral than God, more ethical than God, etc. But deeper. Let's go deeper. Think of any positive good attribute that you can think of. Take that to an infinite degree. Follow that good attribute to its actual home. Peer into its window of its home. And what you will see peering back at you is the face of Krishna. That is what's meant by pure. And more, and the enemy of all impurity. In other words, that Krishna is the very opposite of that which is the very opposite of the pure. So again, goodness, truth, love, compassion, beauty, etc., etc., taken to its ultimate degree. Now imagine that in the opposite. In other words, that which is of the nature of illusion. that God is a being who is the very opposite of illusion. That is what is meant by this very last clause. Very good. 2 verses. I think I said the last time that it looks like we're going to be doing the Gopala-Tapani Upanishad 2 verses at a time. So that's it. We're going to stop here with these 2 verses. So all that being said, I thank you all very much for listening to my very brief discourse. As you can imagine, these were only 2 verses. I actually was rushing. I could have gone infinitely deeper into probably one clause of one of these verses. But we're going to stop here, and I want to see, are there any questions? Any sincere questions about Sanatana Dharma? Not about politics, not about people running for office, not about other religions, not about Kabbalah, not about tarot, not about anything silly. But are there any sincere questions about Sanatana Dharma and how you as a living being can perfect your existence and find peace, find happiness, find joy, find meaning on this path of Sanatana Dharma? Please.
When we talk about God, the term categories comes into play, and categories seem to be restricted to materiality. So is it proper to consider God in a separate category because he transcends materiality? Or is there an actual term that's more appropriate? Or do we even have a reference?
Excellent question. That's actually a very good, very philosophical question. Let me go into this a little bit, actually. Categories are indeed important within the context of the material world and intellect in order to understand anything that is higher. So philosophy, what is the nature of God, etc., etc. So these things are indeed important in order to try to understand God, and in the process of understanding God. They are something that are very important. Without categories, you don't think. It's interesting for people who, again, people today, or for the last 40 years, they kind of repeat things and they think they're being smart and they're just repeating things and there's no intelligence behind these things. So people will rail on about, we shouldn't put things in categories, like hierarchy. Categories is a dirty word, and yet the truth of the matter is, without categories, there's no such thing as thinking. Thinking does not exist without categories. Indeed, that very person who's saying that statement, categories are worthless, is putting you in a category as an individual who uses categories. So categories and putting things in categories properly ordering things metaphysically, as far as understanding, employing logic, etc., they are important. Now, there are 2 things. There is working with the tools that we have within this material world to come to an understanding of God on the one hand. But then there is understanding God on his own terms on the other hand. When it comes to understanding God directly, and more importantly, let me state it this way. When it comes to God understanding himself, yes, this is something that transcends categories. Not distinction, but categories. Distinction is there. See, there's a difference. There's a difference between distinction versus categories. So in other words, even let's say when you are purely in the spiritual realm, you're no longer in this material world, you're no longer trying to know God. Let's say you know God, you are in Vaikuntha, you are in the supreme realm. At this point, using logical categorization in order to try to understand God, that doesn't exist. It's not necessary. However, distinction is always there. In other words, always understanding the idea of me and that which is not me, such that I can relate to that which is not me. That's distinction. And that is always there. Indeed, that is something that is actually inherent to the soul. Indeed, this is one of the things that occurs very early on in the soul. That first we have self-awareness, awareness of self. Then we have awareness of that which is outside self. without being able to do this spiritually speaking, that is, understand distinction, in the same way that we couldn't think in the material world without categories, we cannot operate in the spiritual world without distinction. Because all that there would be me. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, that's the egotism that made us fall into the material world to begin with. We have to be able to understand other. Indeed, what it means to be truly spiritual and in the spiritual realm is that our relationship with other is perfect. Our relationship with God is perfect. Our relationship with other Atmans is perfect. But there is other. So there's distinction. But not category, because category is only necessary indeed for logic and for a quantitative realm, which is the material world. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, my pleasure. Very good. And I see there are many questions that are coming in online now. Very good. I see the beginning of a question here. Namaste, Sri Acharya-ji. I had a quick question about the purpose of Kali Yuga and the cycle of yugas. But then I don't see the actual question, so maybe it comes later. Let me see what other questions there are. Very nice. Here's a wonderful statement from Robin. And Robin, it is absolutely wonderful seeing you on here. And you say, only by the mercy of the Guru can one remember Krishna. And without such remembrance, existence is meaningless. For one who understands this, gratitude for Guru eternally increases. Jaya Shri Guru. Wonderful. Let me say, Robin, that very often you'll make statements like this, and they are not only eloquent, but they express truth perfectly. So thank you for saying that. It's very true. Vishwajit says, thank you so much, Sri Acharya-ji, for opening my eyes and for all that you do. Jaya Sriman Narayana. Absolutely. My pleasure. And another statement, but a question here as well from Marvin. It is, Namaste Acharya-ji, thank you from the bottom of my heart for your teachings and your wisdom. My pleasure. Can you share with us your thoughts on the phrase, serve Jiva as Shiva? Well, I can't comment on that because I've never heard that before, ever. So you'd have to tell me where that, from whence that is derived. I've never heard that, and I've been on this path for 50 years. So yeah, if you can please tell me, is that some person who says that, or where that's from? I've never actually heard that. But thank you for the question. Dhanvantari says, my obeisances unto you, Sri Acharya-ji. Thank you as always for sharing your wisdom. Dhanvantari, very good to see you here. Here's a nice comment from Keshava. Wonderful discourse, Sri Acharya-ji. Humble obeisances unto you. I very much miss the wonderful association of you and the others at the temple. It will be hard to maintain the fire I felt basking there. Absolutely wonderful. Wonderful comment. And for people who don't know, what Keshava is referring to is we had our International Sanatana Dharma Conference here in Omaha just last weekend, actually, and it was truly amazing. It was the best conference, both as far as the quality of the conference and the number of people who participated. It was the 10th conference, and it was the best that we've had in all 10 years of annual conferences that we've had. And let me tell you, Keshava, both you and everyone else who was here last weekend, we miss all of you as well. Very good. So very nice. So far, many wonderful comments. Many wonderful comments. Let me read this. This is from Stilgar, and Namaste. Very good to see you from the UK. Namaste, Sri Acharya-ji. But I notice that the more I say and hear the names of Krishna, the sweeter they become. I have found this quite a revelation. How do I deepen the experience? Excellent question. Well, first of all, let me say that is indeed the case. And indeed, in one book by my guru, The Search for Sri Krishna, Reality the Beautiful, indeed, in one section, he talks about this, actually, about diving deeper and deeper and deeper into the names of Krishna. And how when you do indeed dive deeply into meditating upon the names of Krishna, at first they're sweet to the point where, yes, you come to what you think is a maximum. But of course, these are the names of God that we're talking about. There is no such thing as a maximum. And the names become sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. So that is indeed the case. And you ask, how do I deepen the experience? Surrender. By surrender. By, of course, doing more and more and more. This is the nature of sadhana. This is the nature of, again, repetition, of, again, repeatedly. Remember, we spoke about that word before. You continue and you continue more. And the quantity serves quality. That's the important thing. Is that, of course, the more you do, the better, but ultimately in the service of quality. So you continue to meditate on the names of Krishna more and more and more, but more, this is what deepens, with surrender. With surrender, with surrender. With devotion, absolutely, but especially with surrender. And this is what deepens the experience more and more, because in reciting the names of Krishna, again, for individuals who don't quite understand how mantra meditation works, no, it's not just mere repetition, it's not just self-hypnosis, it's not just some sort of materialistic thing. With mantra meditation, the idea is that these are the names of God. This being the case, because these are the names of God, God is present. God being present, when you then surrender to God, how can the experience not get deeper? So indeed, this is the most important thing, is surrender, surrender, surrender. But very good question. Very good. Good. Here's a question from Linda. It is, Dear Acharyaji, how does Sri Krishna's personality and appearance compared to Sri Narayana's personality and appearance? They are the same. Krishna is not divided. You remember this. Narayana is not divided. This is Vishnu Tattva. So indeed, for our purposes, as well as for God's purposes in Lila, in play, God will appear variegated. So you have Narayana, and then you have all the multifarious avatars of Narayana. And how many are there? 10? Yeah, that's one. Talk about categories. That's one category. Often you'll hear 10 major avatars. Sometimes you'll hear 24 avatars. And indeed, their names are listed. And then sometimes, interestingly, this confuses people. Sometimes when you have a list, you'll find a list of, let's say, 10 in one Purana, and then another list of 10 in a different Purana, and they'll be ever so slightly different. And of course, this is what confuses academicians. Oh, you see, the scriptures are contradicting each other. For people with, again, to quote Prabhupada, a poor fund of knowledge, of course, it may seem like a contradiction until you understand the truth of the situation. How many avatars are there? An unlimited number, an infinite number. Indeed, it's said in the scriptures there are as many avatars as there are waves in the ocean. And this is all Vishnu Tattva. So, for our purposes, do they have different characteristics? Even a little bit different personalities? Some will look different. Some are blue, some are green. Rama is often depicted as being green. They'll have different pastimes. They do different things, etc., etc., etc. But in actuality, they're all Vishnu Tattva. They're all Sriman Narayana. So as far as the specific attributes of Krishna, you can read Krishna book, you can read 10th canto, 10th skanda of Srimad Bhagavatam, and you can see what the attributes of Krishna are specifically, and then you can compare that to Rama in the Ramayana, among other places, and you can compare that to, and pick any avatar. But in actuality, all the avatars with all of their attributes ultimately have Sriman Narayana as their source. All of these attributes, all of them without exception, exist in Sriman Narayana. So I hope that answers the question. good. Good. Here's an interesting question. This is a good question, actually, from Kings. And it is, Dear Acharyaji, please accept my humble obeisances, and please accept mine as well. How would you address Advaita Vedantists' claim that material creation is just God's pastime, where God is pretending not to be God? Very good. I would address this very, very quickly and easily. That is not what Advaita Vedantists teach. That's a New Age idea. Very simply. This, let me put it this way. In fact, let me stretch back a little bit. Let me answer this in a little bit of detail. Sadly, and I've talked about this in depth in the past, there are several different strata, one inferior to another, inferior to another, inferior to another, of what people will call, and I'm going to use this very general term, non-dualism. Now, there is Advaita per se. What is Advaita per se? Advaita is the teaching of Gaudapada. It is the teaching of his disciplic grandson, one could say, Shankara Acharya, and then a handful of other Advaitin Acharyas who lived within the first, let's say, roughly 500 to 600 years after Shankaracharya. That is Advaita proper. Now, Advaita proper does not teach what you just said here. That is, and I'll read this again, the claim that material creation is just God's pastime where God is pretending not to be God. That is not what Advaita Vedanta teaches. Advaita Vedanta teaches that the material world itself does not exist. Indeed, anything that is separate from Brahman does not exist. Also, there is a distinction in traditional, i.e. orthodox, in other words, real Advaita Vedanta. There is a distinction between Brahman, which exists in and of itself, in perfection, does not have emotion, does not have form, does not have need, etc. There's a distinction between that is Brahman, versus Bhagavan, which is God in more personal terms. One could also say Nirguna versus Saguna. And the idea that traditional Advaita Vedanta has is that while you can see both in the scriptures, the idea of Bhagavan is a step down from the idea of pure Brahman. Understanding Brahman, all that exists is Brahman. Anything outside of Brahman has non-existence to it. And now it is also the nature of Brahman that Brahman does not have needs. So Brahman does not have the need for pastimes, does not have the need for Leela. This being the case, this whole very recent theory that you just said falls apart. Again, this is not the teaching of traditional Advaita. So you have traditional Advaita, that is the actual teachings of Shankaracharya and his Parama Guru, Gaudapada. Now, then you have Neo-Advaita. Neo-Advaita is, we just put out a video, I believe less than 48 hours ago, on Sanatana Dharma versus Neo-Hinduism. Please, I implore everyone to please watch that video. It just came out 48 hours ago. And I explain what is Neo-Vedanta. This is a phenomenon within Hinduism that is approximately 200 years old. Within Neo-Hinduism, there is something called Neo-Vedanta, which is, again, philosophically an enormous step down from traditional Advaita Vedanta. Now, today, we have a third category of quote-unquote non-dualists. These are the New Age non-dualists. These are individuals who, it's hard to describe how uninformed and unknowledgeable these individuals are compared even to actual Advaitins. We have our philosophical differences with Advaitins, but we at least respect them that they are actual philosophers. Modern non-dualists who are informed by New Age ideas, their ideas can't even approach what would be called philosophy. This idea specifically is a very recent idea that comes from the New Age movement. And that, of course, some very modern so-called non-dualists have grabbed onto. So, indeed, this is not a real idea in any way whatsoever. Advaita Vedantists do not teach this idea. So, how do I answer this? Very simply, that it's self-contradictory. if you are an Advaita Vedantist, a real one, you believe that God is of the nature that God is inconceivable, that God transcends actually philosophy, God transcends personality, God transcends need, etc. That being the case, God, transcending need, would have no need to play. So this whole idea falls apart. So that's how this is answered. It's a non-theory, in other words. It's a non-theory. Very good. But thank you for asking that, because even though it's a non-theory, yes, indeed, we need to know how to answer such questions. Okay, so that I see Michael's follow-up here. So the question is, what would be the purpose of the Kali Yuga and the cycle of the Yugas? That's like asking what's the purpose of the seasons. It's a again, forgive me, but it's a non-question. They simply are. It's like asking what is the purpose of anything that is a natural cycle. The purpose is that it has been. The purpose is that cycles are part of Dharma, and that being the case, there are seasons. There are cycles within a human being's life. It means that living beings come into being. They're born. They're here for some time. They grow old, and they pass away. As far as was the purpose of cycles within the context of Dharma, better to ask a deeper question than that. Very good. Very good. All right, and here's another follow-up from Marvin McBride. I had asked him what was the source of this saying to serve Jiva as Shiva, and he gives a thank you for this answer. He gives what I was suspecting was the actual answer. His answer is the internet. The source is the internet. The internet says that a principle Swami Vivekananda learned from his master was Ramakrishna, was indeed this silly saying, to serve Jiva as Shiva. Yes, that's not a source. That's an illegitimate source. We don't accept, sadly, either Swami Vivekananda or Ramakrishna as legitimate gurus in any way whatsoever. We respect the fact that that Vivekananda came to the West, and he happened to be the first, let's say, Hindu Swami, Neo-Hindu. He was a Neo-Hindu. He was the first to come to the West and to begin teaching in the West in such a way that he helped Westerners to have a great appreciation for Hinduism, but we don't take his philosophical teachings seriously on many, many different levels. So indeed, it's not a statement I'm going to comment on because it's meaningless. It doesn't come from the scriptures. Very good. And indeed, this is something I have heard, that indeed Vivekananda did say this, because you have yet another follow-up, to serve mankind as God. That's what's called Marxism. That's not Vedic. That's not Vedic. We serve God directly. Why serve mankind as God when you can serve God directly? So we serve God directly. That's what the totality of the Vedic scriptures tell us to do. We have compassion toward our fellow humans. We do charity toward our fellow humans, certainly. But to serve mankind as God, no, that is the very opposite of what the Vedic scriptures teach. Better to worship God as God. Very good. Very nice. Wonderful. All right, with that, I believe we're going to stop here, both because we've come to the end of our questions, as well as it is a little bit past the hour, so we are indeed going to stop here. I thank you all very much again for being here, and of course we're going to continue next week with more of the Gopala-Tapani Upanishad, and we will just keep going until we run out of wonderful verses. Which means that we may end up doing the entire thing, but I'll try not to. We will try our best to maybe just do one or two more sessions of Gopala-Tapani Upanishad. But as we've seen, it's a wonderful, beautiful Upanishad to go through. And with that, again, I thank you all very much for being here. Please join us next week when we get together again and continue our exploration of Lord Krishna and devotion toward him. And everyone together. Jaya Shriman Narayana.
Jaya Shriman Narayana.
Jaya Bhagavan Sri Krishna.
Jaya Bhagavan Sri Krishna.
Jaya Shri Guru.
Jaya Shri Guru.
Sanatana Dharma Jayate.
Sanatana Dharma Jayate.
Dharmarashtra Jayate.
Dharma Rashtra Jayate.
Suryavansha Jayate.
Surya Vangsha Jayate.
Evam Bhavatu. And with that, everyone, again, I thank you all for being here. Until the next time that we get together, I ask you all to please take very good care of yourselves in every way.